Okay, up next, we have Dr. Anthony Andres, tutor at Thomas Aquinas College. He's going to be presenting us with Can Study Penetrate What Matters?
All right, thank you. So I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for giving me the chance to talk about liberal education, something I've been thinking about since I was 13 years old. In college, I myself chose to pursue such an education, and I've never regretted it. So today I'm excited to have an opportunity to express systematically why liberal education really matters in the modern world. Now, it seems to me that modern education has become more and more specialized and practical, more and more exclusively devoted to job preparation and to some degree to political action. And this has become true at both the secondary and the tertiary levels. But for the past 50 years, a small but growing number of colleges have been moving in the opposite direction, expanding instead of contracting their core curricula, intent on preserving the ideal of liberal education, and many of those institutions are thriving. Our host for this conference, John Paul II Junior College, is one such institution, and I teach at another, Thomas Aquinas College in California. Now, these colleges have been attracting more and more students, and their graduates, far from being handicapped by their lack of specialized training, seem to thrive on the job market. And all of that can seem puzzling to those who are not familiar with the more radical vision, I should say, of liberal education, which such institutions espouse. So, today, I'd like to introduce you to what this kind of education, which we're calling liberal education, is really all about, and make a case for why it gets to the heart of what really matters. First, I want to talk about what a liberal education is according to the classic understanding of that term. And second, I want to explain why this kind of educational program, although it seems outdated, obsolete, is still successful, in spite of how fundamentally different it is from most other programs of higher education that we see in the modern world. After that, I'd love to talk about this more with you in the breakout session if you can make it. Now, first I want to give you some picture of what the universities in Europe considered a liberal education centuries ago, before the French Revolution, which, by the way, was not just a political revolution, but was also a religious and educational revolution that swept through all of Europe. The old European universities thought that a liberal education should begin with an education in the liberal arts, which in those days were not thought of as humanities, that is, as primarily literary and cultural studies. Instead, the liberal arts were considered as the necessary preliminaries to the study of what really matters. Now, the liberal arts in the old universities were 7, 3 concerned with the verbal arts, namely grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and 4 concerned with mathematical arts, arithmetic, geometry, music, theory, and astronomy. Now, by learning the art of grammar, a student learned to construct an intelligible sentence. By learning logic, he learned to put premises together to validly reach a conclusion. And in the study of rhetoric, he learned to speak clearly and persuasively. The old universities thought that a student who couldn't do these things, couldn't construct an intelligible sentence, couldn't reason from premise to conclusion or speak persuasively, was not yet ready to study the disciplines that mattered most. And of course, we modern educators still see the importance of our students acquiring these kinds of abilities. Consequently, the liberal arts were called liberal arts because they were there to prepare students for a liberal education. But the ancient thinkers thought that the heart of a liberal education consisted of a further set of disciplines: moral philosophy, the philosophy of nature, first philosophy or metaphysics, and sacred theology. Moral philosophy includes ethical and political philosophy. The philosophy of nature, of the natural world, touches on the principles of what we call natural science. First philosophy or metaphysics studies the most general principles of existence itself and terminates in the consideration of the existence and properties of God, considered as the first principles of all things. And finally, sacred theology studies God again, but this time as the object and source of divine revelation. So we can range these disciplines under three headings: practical philosophy, speculative philosophy, and sacred theology. Taken together, these are what the old European universities before the French Revolution considered the heart of a liberal education. The next question I want to talk about is why they considered such an education liberal. Now, the word liberal is a Latin word whose root is liber, which means free. And as an education called liberal was thought of as the kind of education needed by someone who's going to live a free life, a life unencumbered by chains, literal or metaphorical. How does the man who is free prepare himself for such a life? First, he needs to learn ethics, not just so he can learn not to injure other people, but more importantly, so he can learn to build up the habits in his own life that enable him to properly pursue true happiness. He not only has to learn to be fair to his neighbors, he has to learn how to discipline his own inclinations if he's going to have any chance for real happiness. And so the man who's free needs to study moral philosophy. But he also needs to take part in public affairs, so he has to learn political philosophy as well. He needs to learn not just what kinds of governments are good and bad, but also how to make the best possible contribution to his own society, knowing that it already has a given form of government and culture. So all this means that political philosophy also needs to be part of a liberal education. I don't think it's too hard to make the case that liberal education should include ethics and political philosophy. But it's harder to explain why the philosophy of the natural world, why metaphysics, and why sacred theology were considered not only part of a liberal education, but the chief parts, the crowning achievement of that kind of education. To us modern educators, it just seems unreasonable to take three useless disciplines and organize a whole program of higher education around them. And it seems even stranger when we consider what these disciplines have in common that makes them so useless. They're useless in principle because they study subjects over which mankind has no control. Think about first philosophy, the study of being as being and the principles of being. Now, as technologically advanced as we are or ever might become, we cannot make, change, or alter the fundamental conditions of the existence of the universe. And we can never make it true that an effect does not have a cause, or that the first cause of all things is not the first cause of all things. The study of first philosophy is kind of eminently useless because it studies principles so universal and is concerned with things so superior to us that we could never have any effect on them at all. The same is true for the philosophy of nature, and is even truer for sacred theology. So how can it make sense for modern colleges to put these very disciplines at the heart of its educational program? How can it even be possible for them to do this and attract enough students and support? I think the answer to that question is found in the first line of the book titled Metaphysics by the greatest of the ancient Greek philosophers, Aristotle. Aristotle begins the book by writing this: "All men by nature desire to know." He then begins to explain what he means. An indication of this, he says, is the delight we take in our senses, for even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves, and above all others, the sense of sight. For not only with a view to action, but even when we're not going to do anything, we prefer seeing to everything else. When I read these lines, I think about going to the market with my wife. She's actually doing the shopping. I'm just accompanying her. And so I just find a bench, sit down, and wait for her to finish. But what do I do while I'm waiting? I sit and watch the people walk by. Notice I gain nothing practical by seeing them. In fact, if I was more practical, I'd bring my work with me and pay no attention to the people. But I look at them, I watch them, I see them, as Aristotle says, because I take delight just in seeing. And I think Aristotle is using the instance of seeing to make a greater point. If mankind takes such delight in seeing for its own sake, in a kind of seeing that has no practical value, how much more delight does he take in a higher kind of knowing, intellectual knowing? And maybe he especially takes delight in knowing those things which, because they're so superior to us, are so useless for us to know. In fact, Aristotle's assertion, I think, really amounts to this: our intellectual knowledge of the highest things is the source of the greatest joy to human beings in our present life. So let me emphasize to you, if it hasn't already struck you, how radically different this way of thinking about knowledge is from the way that modern men tend to think about knowledge. The early modern philosopher Bacon famously said that knowledge is power. Now, however you understand that assertion, it at least implies that knowledge is to be pursued as a means, not as an end, pursued only insofar as it's useful for acquiring something else besides knowledge. And this implies that freedom exists for something other than knowledge, and that knowledge exists for whatever that other thing may be. But the older intellectual tradition believed that freedom existed for knowledge, and that the education proper to the free man was an education in the subjects which are most useless to know. And that's why it put those subjects at the heart of liberal education. That is the reason why modern curricula tend to exclude disciplines like metaphysics and sacred theology, is the very reason why the ancients put them there in the first place and put them at the heart of their educational program. So let me try to sum up what I've said so far. Modern educators tend to think of knowledge as power. Knowledge is a tool. Knowledge is something to be used to acquire the necessities and luxuries of life. The European universities of the Middle Ages, on the contrary, thought of knowledge as the end and the necessities of life as the means. They required their students to study liberal arts because the liberal arts prepared them for the higher disciplines. But they required them to study theology and philosophy for their own sake because they thought that knowing philosophy and theology were two of life's most worthy pursuits. If the older tradition is right, if knowledge of the highest things is worthwhile for its own sake, then liberal education gets to the heart of what really matters. Now, I want to end here by trying to dispel a false impression you might have picked up. It might seem like I'm trying to say that we should go back to the Middle Ages, that all of our institutions of higher education should devote themselves to offering a liberal education in the classical sense of that term. I don't mean to say that. The world needs the practical. It needs doctors, engineers, scientists, professionals of all kinds. And most people who take up these professions are not going to be able to pursue a liberal education. In fact, although all men by nature desire to know, most people, because of their individual circumstances, or maybe their temperaments and abilities, wouldn't flourish pursuing a liberal education. So I'm not hoping to promote a revolutionary educational agenda in which all the institutions of higher learning devote themselves to philosophy and theology. What I do want to say is that we need to find more space for liberal education in the modern curriculum, and that the world is a poorer place in its absence. Thank you for your patience.